Bowers, The Tragic Era by Donald Davidson. Extra Review, September 15th, 1929. In 1865, the South lost the war. During the next decade, the South lost the peace. A third defeat endured longer. For 60 years and more, at the hands of New England historians, the South lost something imponderable and precious, whose absence from the minds of men made a nearly ineradicable gap between sections. The South suffered historical defeat. It saw monstrous legends persist, not to be refuted by Southern voices, for Southern voices were laughed down under the charge of sectionalism, sentimentalism, and the bloody shirt. It saw a powerful industrial civilization arise under the aegis of a political party whose principle was the dollar, and it knew that that civilization and that party were founded on the crime of Reconstruction. It saw the United States of America become the United States of the North and West, with the solid South as a kind of embarrassing appendage to the real America, while children, even in many Southern schools, developed hazy notions that the center of gravity of American history, originally and mainly in New England, shifted a little west in 1865 and thenceforth reposed in the bosom of Lincoln. One by one, these defeats have been overbalanced by victories. Even Appomattox has been resolved into something like a moral victory. The physical damage and some of the political damage of the Reconstruction have been repaired. Now the last defeat seems to have reached a turning point. The labor of Southern historians, which has had more local and professional than general popular honor, is reinforced by the work of historians, biographers, and journalists, on whom the old suspicion of sectionalism cannot be cast. Lloyd P. Stryker, a New Yorker, minced no words in his vindication of Andrew Johnson, filling out his portrait against a background of Reconstruction times as handily as a Southerner could wish, and lo, his book was well received. Now Claude Bowers, the distinguished editor of the New York World, follows his studies of Jefferson and Hamilton and of Jackson's political battles with a powerful book that covers the same period as Stryker's, and that also expresses with relentless clarity an overwhelming array of facts, the malignity of the crime committed against the South and the nation in the years after 1865. Mr. Bowers' title, The Tragic Era, The Revolution After Lincoln, gives in brief his intent. History books, especially history textbooks, have given the vague impression that the Reconstruction policy forced upon the South against Johnson's will and with Grant's full connivance was unwise and unfortunate, and there they leave the subject, with a few mild deprecations as something hardly worth discussion in later high-minded days. Mr. Bowers shows the episode for what it was, a conspiracy of mad partisans willing to go any length for power, a complete subversion of American institutions, a crime to which the slightest gilding of mistaken idealism cannot possibly be applied. The action of the radicals under Thad Stevens and Sumner, backed by Beast Butler, treacherous Stanton, disreputable Ashley, grotesque Ben Wade, was revolution, deliberately conceived. Within 8 hours of Lincoln's death, a caucus of radicals was framing plans to rid the government of Lincoln influence, as too conciliatory toward the South. Their popular cry was punishment for the rebels. Their program, which had secret ends, included measures partly idealistic in appearance, like Negro suffrage, others vengeful and stringent, like confiscation of Southern property, subjugation of the states under military rule, which military rule in turn was naturally to be controlled by radical party leaders. If Andrew Johnson got in the way, as he of course did, His head must fall under trumped-up articles of impeachment. If the Constitution hindered, it was a league with death and a covenant with hell, and it would be abrogated, suspended, or, as a more technical and decent concession, amended. Even the Supreme Court was not to be inviolate, and the principle of preserving the Union, for which the war had presumably been fought, was to be contradicted and pitched overboard whenever the political game so required. I shall not here recapitulate the steps by which Thad Stevens and his fellow conspirators gained their ends, or saw the picture of the results that followed. Mr. Bowers gives these in great detail, stopping now and then to draw a portrait, either of a conspirator or of a courageous figure who fought back, or to paint the social background of Washington in Johnson's and Grant's administrations, or to trace the turbulent and foul conditions under which the Reconstruction scheme operated in the Southern states, or the firm, skillful, and intrepid measures by which the carpetbaggers and scalawags were finally routed. Mr. Bowers' method is simply to weave together the numerous strands of fact without heat and practically without comment. His book, indeed, is almost overloaded with facts, carefully pegged down and annotated. I, for one, should have liked more expansiveness, which would have made the work longer, but would have allowed for the interpretive comment that I conceive it to be the function of the historian, as an expert in full possession of the facts, to give. Footnote. Bowers explained his attitude as follows in a letter of September 15, 1929, to Davidson. I note what you say about absence of editorializing. Being well known as a Democrat, I would be open to debate on opinions, but by giving the story, raw and ugly, they must quarrel with the facts of the record and not with the opinions of a benighted Democrat. End of footnote. But I do not blame Mr. Bowers for being perfectly objective. The facts themselves are tragic and damnable enough in many a case, and in other cases heroic. They are the safest instrument for presenting the unvarnished truth that, as the author says, makes so many statues in public squares and parks seem a bit grotesque. The distinction of Mr. Bowers' book, as I see it, is threefold. First of all, I put the firmness and courage with which he has assaulted the citadels of the smug and complacent, and brought into the light a subject too often discreetly hushed up. Mr. Bowers puts that subject unequivocally before us, and makes it possible, yes, makes it of high public importance, to reconsider its painful and terrible incidents, as well as its strange underlying motives, in relation to issues now before us. Second, the fullness of the concentrated vigor with which he presents men and motives, as well as accumulated incidents, bring this tragic era before us on a national scale, and enable us to study Reconstruction in its bearing on the entire national life of the period. Such a brief study as Dr. Walter L. Fleming's The Sequel of Appomattox, published some years ago, leaves nothing to be desired so far as all the major facts are concerned. Mr. Bowers's study does not surpass Dr. Fleming's in historical quality or in penetration of the issues, but in its array of facts is bulkier and its pictorial background more extensive. Mr. Bowers's thousands of ordered facts, gathered from unpublished sources such as the Julian Diary, as well as all the usual documentary sources, suggest the many thousands more from which he made selection. On page after page, one feels the impact of the unsaid. He has furthermore emphasized the deeds of many men often neglected, Southern and Northern alike. The central figures do not have the stage to themselves. Third, and here I return to the major theme, Mr. Bowers makes plain beyond question the meaning of the entire radical scheme, which eventuated in the attack on Andrew Johnson and the nearly successful destruction of Southern society. How did the radicals, under the malign leadership of Stevens, manage to get support in Congress for a program that was obviously unconstitutional and even more obviously evil and inhumane? How did they manage to deceive many good and otherwise decent minded Northern citizens into giving aid and applause? The rather stuffy James Russell Lowell, for instance. The answer is easy, though it seems incredible. These wolves in sheep's clothing were able, first of all, to capitalize the hysteria that followed the assassination of Lincoln, in whose death they actually rejoiced because it served their purpose. In this and in the so called outrage that later occurred in the South when black soldiers and white police, as in Memphis, or black freedmen and white Klansmen, as nearly anywhere, clashed, or in all the induced or natural disorders that either existed or were fabricated for their ends, they found provender to feed the already inflamed imagination of the public. Their oppressive program was thus actually strengthened, for a long while, by its very oppressiveness, and we may contemplate the spectacle of an American people in apparent possession of their senses, condoning and even applauding the subjection of 11 states inhabited by their brother Americans to the rule of their late slaves, egged on and instructed by venal white invaders who were often worse than the blacks themselves. Thad Stevens and his crew had a stronger weapon still, the lure of power. We may ask, did they actually believe in the principle of Negro suffrage for which they clamored? Possibly Stevens did, though I doubt it somewhat. Mr. Bowers claims Stevens was sincere, and though in general scoring him heavily, also touches him lightly, as he touches Sumner, with the whitewash brush. If Stevens was sincere, his sincerity was a monstrous thing that worked cunningly and brought profitable results. Negro suffrage and the slogan of black heels on white necks were the sine qua non of the radical plan, because only through Negro suffrage and corresponding disenfranchisement of the Southern whites could the political security of the radicals be established. Here is the clue, openly admitted by Thad Stevens himself. He wished to view the Southern states as conquered provinces. Convenient trick, and to institute Negro suffrage in order to secure perpetual ascendancy to the party of the Union. Here was the bait, the appeal to the loaves and fishes, the spoils counter, the job market. By this means were recalcitrant party men whipped into line, even for so miserable a device as the impeachment proceedings and the various force bills. The appeal to power, especially when it is camouflaged with a show of humanitarianism, is always attractive, and among politicians it always wins over principle. The profligacy of Grant's administration, the general mismanagement in the initiation of the Negro into his new rights, the depletion of the humiliation of the South under carpetbag governments backed by federal bayonets, the virtual prostitution of Congress, and its subsequent decay in statesmanship, even to this day, the increasing trend towards over-centralization of government, and social and political evils too many to enumerate, all may be traced, I feel, after reading this book, in large degree to the vindictive ambition and evil genius of Thad Stevens and his gang. No American, I feel sure, whether of North or South, can read the record and think on its results without a deep sense of shame and revolt. Nor can we, with Mr. Bowers's book in hand, regard our present enlightened stage of progress with much more comfort. The Reconstruction tragedy was ended by the determination of Southerners who, by actual show of arms, backed at last by the awakened sympathy and disgust of more thinking Northerners, put the rascals out. Yet the results stayed on. Let me quote from Mr. Bowers. Power had passed during the Revolution from the agriculturist to the industrialist and the financier, and these, more powerful than the politicians, had become the party's allies. A degree of centralization not dreamed of in other days had been realized. State rights were to be denounced for 40 years as the equivalent of treason. A new order had to be established, built upon the ruins of the old. The Jeffersonian Republic that came in with the Revolution of 1800 gave way to the Hamiltonian Republic brought in by the Counter Revolution of 1865 to 76. The tables had been turned. The age old fight would continue, the spirits of Jefferson and Hamilton leading as before, but the advantage under the new order had passed to the latter. So at last, here we stand with the shades of Jefferson and Hamilton beside us, the one surely thoughtful and melancholy, the other smiling a little too triumphantly. This able book that brings the issues of the past so graphically before us, by strongest implication, bids us to regard the issues of the present. Whither shall we turn now? And what will the future historian write of our choice in an era which, likewise, has its tragedies of greed and malignancy, its foul triumphs of expediency over principle, while the cloak of idealism, ornamented with misappropriated words like service, prosperity, and progress, often hides a low purpose and a selfish creed. The South, at least, in the day when history is doing belated justice, might well revive, especially in its younger generation, the historical consciousness that has always been part of its peculiar genius. Thinking on its past, always inevitably involved with its present, is the South not likely to find, while it views its old foe in the North with friendship and generosity, the Southern shade of Jefferson, a more comforting one for the future than the other shade with which all of its material grandeur is, as of yore, a little too much kin to the powers of darkness?